All right, so today we're going to be doing something a little different and a lot more cliche. I want to review a forest carbon project, a REDD+ project put out there by Vera. The project is named Rio Preto / Jacundá, and this is a project that's on the market now, and it was started in 2012. And my goal here is not necessarily to just start reviewing every single carbon project on Earth, but I hope that by seeing what I'm looking at when I review these projects, you can get a better sense of how to review these projects yourself. So let's start off right here. This is a project that's taking place on the edge of the Amazon, so it's in Brazil. So it's obviously in a place in an area suffering from an intense deforestation, which is always kind of a good sign in terms of forest carbon projects. Let's take a look at the documentation here. This is the official project description document, and as is usual for these mega REDD+ projects, this thing is 250 pages long. So there are nuclear arms treaties that are less complicated than this REDD+ project. So this is an image here from the date that the project started, and what we can see here is, it's being surrounded by deforestation in 2012. Quick overview: the project is about 100,000 hectares large, so it's a very large project. So as you guys know, there are basically 5 pillars to forest carbon projects: additionality, baseline, leakage, verification, and permanence. And I encourage you guys to learn more about them in my earlier videos, but I'm going to be going through each of those and seeing how this project performs. The project basically takes place on what is essentially kind of already preserved community land. It's quasi-preserved, not necessarily preserved very well. And the land is owned by a set of community associations with the native populace who lives in this project. And so there are a couple of villages at the base of this project who kind of manage the land. And for me, going down the list, starting with additionality, this is a bit of a red flag. I hate to say it, but community projects tend to have more issues, in my experience, than projects that are just owned by a private organization. And I think one of the reasons for this is that communities, they need to basically police the land themselves. So we're reliant on community policing. We're reliant on the law enforcement of the area. And this is potentially a real problem because, police are corrupt. On the other hand, projects that are private can, put up gates, they can hire, armed private security, and they can pursue, lawsuits in court probably more successfully than, this native community. And so unfortunately, this is the first indicator that, this is potentially a little challenging. We're all bleeding heart liberals here. We're supposed to be in it for both the earth and the native communities. But I'm not a people person. I'm here for the earth. And frankly, communities will let me down more often than private land ownerships. So that's a little taste of things to come. Right now we're looking at satellite imagery from 2012. Let's take a look at what this project was like earlier in its history. So we're going back to 1984 now. This is just in Google Earth. You should all be doing this. One quick note, this project area, nobody necessarily has access to the project areas because it's kind of all hidden behind Vera standards. But what I do have access to is the actual project description document. And so I went through here until I found this, one of these actual outlines. I georeferenced that, and then I basically drew by hand where the project area is. So it's not perfect, my drawing, but it's the only data that's publicly available. Okay, so we're now in Google Earth, and we want to see what's happened around this project leading up to it, to say whether or not the project is justified, to say whether or not the project has additionality. And what we can see, absolutely, is a creep of deforestation, likely conversion to cattle fields, drawing nearer and nearer to this project. By the year 2000, we see pretty significant ingress toward, basically to the edges of this project. We're going to creep on forward to the project start date. By 2006, pretty much everything south of the project is in some way under development or facing deforestation. 2008, 2009. And then finally, we come to the project start date. So I would say this project is extremely well justified. And so it checks off the additionality box. It's a highly additional project. Now I want to actually back that up with data. And one of my best tools for actually assessing these projects is a public data set put out by Global Forest Watch that basically monitors deforestation over time. And so this is put out by Global Forest Watch. It's developed by the University of Maryland Hansen Lab, and it's also developed by NASA. And so this is basically just measuring deforestation rates over time. If I click around this map, I can basically get the year that these areas were deforested. Blue areas were deforested a long time ago. This map goes back to 2000, and more orange areas were deforested recently. So this one, for example, was deforested in 2020. Now, I have clipped out the area inside the project because I don't want to give away the big reveal. So this is basically the area that was deforested outside the project before it began. And the goal of this is basically to prove whether or not this project has additionality. Now, I actually want to chart some of this data out. And so what I've done here is I've actually put a buffer around the project, and we're going to look at what the deforestation rate was in the immediate vicinity around the project to see if it was really high and if the project is well justified. We already know that it is, but we want to do it with numbers. So when I actually chart this out in Excel, year by year, this is the deforestation rate that's occurred in the buffer area outside the project. So you can see about 18% of the area in the 30 kilometers surrounding the project has actually been deforested already. Now, in reality, the deforestation is very directional, right? So it's all coming from the south. So in reality, like, there's probably more pressure than just 18%. It's not like anybody can actually access the forest on this side of the river right now that easily. All right, so we've established the additionality. Let's take a look at the project's baseline. Now, again, in the project documentation, this is all kind of laid out in a very oblique way, mind you. So we can actually scroll down to the baseline numbers, and this will tell us what the anticipated emissions were if the project didn't exist. And we want to compare that, and we want to see whether or not that's a fair number. Because if it's not a fair number, then we potentially have a problem because maybe these credits were overissued. So first things first, the project's baseline is developed using a reference region, as most of these REDD+ projects are. And the reference region is just this black area around the project and to the south. The reference region, at a glance, it seems fairly reasonable to me. Deforestation is coming from the south. This is likely what's really going to take place over the lifetime of the project. I'm not seeing a reference region that's 1,000 kilometers away or has completely different, situation. This reference region seems likely. So we're off to a good start for this baseline here. Now, we just extracted how much deforestation is taking place in this buffer area around the project. How does that compare to the baselines that they're putting forward? So I'm basically wanting to ask, okay, are they claiming that more deforestation is going to happen than we've actually observed in the past in the area around the project? And to do that, I'm just going to chart these two out. And so what we have here on the left is the baseline that's proposed by them, the annual deforestation rate. So they're saying that on average inside their project, about maybe 1.15% of the project is going to be deforested annually. And what I've observed using this tree cover loss map put out by UMD and NASA is that in reality, around the project, a little over 1.5% is being deforested annually. So this is good. This is great. Their baseline is not only, their baseline is, if anything, too conservative. Their baseline is maybe being too cautious. They should potentially be issued with a little bit more credits if they were just looking at the area directly around their project. So we've got a checkbox there. Now, one thing that's interesting here is that the project itself, it maps the baseline out spatially. And so what you're seeing here in this figure, and this is directly imaged from the project description document, that's why the resolution's low, is what they expected would have happened on the project if the project didn't exist. So they expected, for example, by 2027, they expected these northern areas to be deforested and some heavy deforestation to the south. And by 2042, by the end of the project, the last year, it's a 40-year project, started in 2012, they expected pretty much the northern left half to be gone and the bottom right. So what this means is that they're not actually receiving credits for every single tree in the project. They're only receiving credits for these red areas, because those are the red areas. Those are the areas that they thought were at risk. We don't want to give credits for the entire project area if the project area wasn't likely to be deforested. So this is their spatial baseline, and let's keep this in mind for the future here, because this is the outcome that they proposed was going to happen if they hadn't stepped in and stopped deforestation from taking place. Next, I want to move on to leakage. Now, leakage in these projects, in these mega projects, are kind of assessed in two ways. The first is market leakage. So there's just a generic deduction of the credits they'll receive. And the second is basically this idea of geographic leakage. So they want to look and see whether or not deforestation has gone up in the past. Now, let me ask you this. Do you think that all this deforestation that's taken place out here is a result of the project taking place? Or was it just going to happen anyway? I have a hard time believing that a project that's taking place on the edge of Amazon deforestation is somehow contributing to deforestation right next door. So the project is probably going to be penalized for leakage because, there's a lot of deforestation taking place around it. But, in reality, I think this was going to happen anyway. And this is one of the reasons why I think leakage is kind of a flawed concept and really difficult to measure for an individual project. So I'm not going to get into whether or not this project is causing leakage. I don't think it matters. I think that deforestation rates were going up, and the project, didn't have anything to do with that. I think it had more to do with the presidential election in Brazil a couple of years ago. I want to revisit, while we're still on leakage, what the leakage belt looks like. This black area is the reference region. The leakage belt, where they're actually monitoring for leakage, are these green areas. So one might ask, why is there any difference? Why don't you just use the reference region for the leakage belt? Well, that's a good question. The fact is they are incentivized to find a leakage belt that has the least amount of deforestation, and they're incentivized to find a reference region that has the most amount of deforestation. So their leakage belt is basically a set of areas that are also owned by communities and also, reserved forests, and their reference region is just the whole area around it. Say what you will, but this is the kind of thing that happens with Vera. All right, so we've covered additionality, baseline, and leakage, and it all pretty much looks good. All right, they're probably getting dinged on leakage. I don't think it had anything to do with them. Let's go on to verification. What am I looking for verification? First, I want to know, is the carbon inventory itself sound? Unfortunately, with a lot of these REDD+ projects, they're not actually measuring the carbon inside the project. They're just taking a regional average and assuming that's how much carbon there is. And that is deeply flawed, because you could be off by 50% or more. And it also opens you up to cheating, because you can then take a regional average that kind of favors, issuance of more credits. Here, though, what I'm looking for is whether or not they actually measured the carbon inside their project. And sure enough, we find this in the project description document on page 137. They do, in fact, have forest inventory plots. So they have a statistically sound method of measuring the carbon in their project. We can trust those numbers. I also want to look at the allometry. What the allometry means is basically the equations that they were using to take tree measurements and then convert that to carbon. And sometimes people will fudge the numbers, find weird allometry, come up with their own equations. They have used an allometric equation that is old. It's not necessarily industry standard, but it's still, I think, valid. So we'll give them the pass there. Finally, we have to look at permanence. All right. So permanence is basically just asking whether or not these projects is continuing to meet its commitments. And this is where I've been kind of holding back on you here. This is the image that we've been looking at from 2012. As we inch forward in time, we can see there's been dramatic changes inside the project area. By 2015, we start to see some deforestation taking place inside the project. By 2016, it gets a little worse. And let's just go ahead and hop on up to today. By 2020, a large section of the project has been deforested. And if we actually calculate the numbers, it's at least 10% of the project area has been deforested. And this is quite tragic. Now, the deforestation that you're seeing here, what does that actually remind you of? It reminds me of the baseline numbers that they were claiming they were preventing from taking place. Essentially, I would say that deforestation equivalent to at least 2022 or 2027 has taken place inside this project. And so this is a major red flag, right? The project, it appears as if it has failed to stop deforestation. And so we want to actually crunch the numbers. Let's take a look at what the deforestation rate actually looks like inside the project according to the remote sensing data. And when we turn it on, we can see that these are the areas that have, apparently been deforested. Pretty large areas. This is a heavily industrial operation. Tens of thousands of hectares have been deforested inside this project. So how does this compare to their baseline? How does it compare to what they claimed they were going to do? We can, extract the numbers from their baseline, and we can extract the yearly deforestation rates from the satellite imagery, the Global Forest Watch map. And what we get here is basically this chart right here that shows that deforestation has been pretty much on par with what they said was going to take place if the project didn't exist. In fact, we're ending a little bit more deforestation than their baseline scenario. And, it looks like a small difference here, but those are tens of thousands of credits. So this is really quite bad, and it appears as if the project hasn't prevented any deforestation whatsoever. So what's going to happen here? I can tell you for certain that even though this project has essentially failed to prevent any failed to stop any deforestation, the deforestation is actually worse than they thought it would be under the baseline scenario. They still have a bunch of credits that were issued to them in 2015. In fact, we can look at the credit issuance right here, and this project was issued 1.3 million credits up until 2015. Now, all those trees are gone, right? Like, all those trees that they were basically issued credits for were cut down. Most of this deforestation didn't happen until after 2015. So, 1.3 million credits, to put that in perspective, that's many, I would say, that's the average annual output of thousands of Americans, if not more. So this is a huge amount of pollution that, has supposedly been offset, that pollution has just gone right into the atmosphere. So what's going to happen with this project going forward? The last verification was in 2015. And one has to wonder why they haven't verified the project since then. It's not very usual to sit there and wait. And I think the answer is obvious. They know that they're in trouble, and they just don't want to re-verify and have to face this issue. And so their credits, the ones from 2015 are still floating around the market. Now, Vera has a rule that you have to re-verify every 10 years, otherwise the project gets dropped from the system. Well, that 10 years is up in 2022, right? They'd have to re-verify. It turns out that they have gotten an exemption from Vera. You can view it right here. Due to COVID, they're not going to be able to remeasure this project, and they're going to delay it at least until 2022, but probably further down the line if you had to ask me. Now, let's think about this from the project developer point of view. This is a mega project. It is literally too big to fail, right? Like, this would be splashed all over the newspapers if it failed. There are thousands of people involved in this project. Communities are being paid money. That money would stop. Many people have been mobilized. So they're just not going to let this thing fail. And so what are the options for the project developer? Well, in the past, one thing that I've seen failing projects do is actually redraw their boundaries. So maybe in the next verification that's due at the end of this year, they're just going to redraw this project boundary so that it just goes around and just excludes all this new deforestation. And then their new project will just be taking place in a smaller area. Yeah, people can do that. And they basically just, reset the boundaries, and they'll start getting issued credits for that little area until it gets deforested, and they redraw the boundaries again. Another popular solution to these kind of problems is every 10 years you're allowed to redraw the baseline. So you're allowed to recalculate the baseline. I have no doubt that their baseline is going to go up, right? So they're going to point to all this deforestation that took place outside of the project, and they're going to say our baseline was too conservative initially, therefore really double the deforestation would have happened. We are therefore actually owed credits. Even though we haven't stopped any deforestation, they would claim that really double the deforestation would have happened if the project didn't exist. Therefore, you need to continue to issue us credits. On Vera's side, there will never be an acknowledgement that this project has failed, that they have to dip into the buffer pool. I don't think they will dip into the buffer pool. Like I said, I think they'll cheat in other ways. But Vera doesn't make it clear when a project has suffered some sort of catastrophic event. The project is supposed to report to the Vera whether or not there's been a catastrophic event. I don't know if they've done that. This is all hush-hush. It's all secret. It's not public. But I don't see, there's no incentives for them to actually report that something has happened. So that's the situation of this project, Rio Preto / Jacundá. Don't buy these credits. They are still on the market. They are going for top dollar, and why not? Because they showed them the satellite image from 2012. They don't show them the current day disaster. I want to end on a high note. I want to point out that there are good carbon projects out there that are in similar situations, and one of them is right next door. Surprise! The Manoa project is right next door. What is the big difference between these two project types? Why does one of them have deforestation deep in its core and the other one not? Well, Manoa on the left here is a private. It's basically a private company, and they're able to post guards. They have gates. On the right here, we've just got this community. One thing about communities that I find difficult is that every human community on Earth is in some way divisive, right? There are members of this community who I guarantee are against this carbon project, even though they're probably getting a fat check. So, this is one of the difficulties of dealing with community projects. So there's our carbon review. The conclusion is don't buy this carbon project. Do a little research ahead of time. Download the Global Forest Watch forest maps. See if there's been deforestation in the project since the project began. See if the project is really justified. Look at their baseline. See whether or not it corresponds to what's actually happening around the project. And then before you know it, you'll be sponsoring projects like Manoa instead of projects like Rio Preto here. And the whole community will then do better. So I think there are about 500 carbon projects worldwide that I know of. I have personally, looked at about 100 of them. I don't have time to make videos of all of them. I'm going to highlight some of the ones that I think are the most flawed and some of the ones that are the most excellent. And hopefully, in watching these reviews, you can see what it is we have to look for. So, lesson the first, look to see that avoided deforestation projects have actually avoided deforestation. All right, this has gone on long enough.